The morning sun cut through the tall glass windows of Harrington Dynamics like a blade, slicing the lobby into bright, sterile strips of light and shadow. Executives in pressed suits and sharp heels moved briskly across the marble floors, their conversations clipped and efficient, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. Into this machine walked a man they barely glanced at. Robert Hale paused just inside the revolving doors, adjusting the strap of his worn leather briefcase on his shoulder. His suit was dark and plain, cut in a style that had fallen out of favor years ago. His shoes, polished to a soft glow, showed scuffs at the toes, the kind that came not from carelessness but from distance traveled. His silver hair caught the sunlight, but not in a way that turned heads with admiration. In this world of youth and speed, silver meant only one thing: slow down, step aside, make room. He approached the security desk where a young man, barely out of college, offered a glance so quick it hardly counted as recognition. "Visitor badge," the guard said automatically, already turning back to his screen. Robert accepted it without comment, affixing the sticker to his lapel. It wrinkled slightly against the fabric, an unintentional but fitting symbol of the day's beginning. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor was silent except for the soft ping of passing levels. Around him, interns stared at their phones, managers rehearsed pitches under their breath, and nobody asked who he was or why he was there. They assumed he was here for an interview. They assumed he was here to beg for a seat at a table already too crowded with ambition. They assumed wrong. At reception, a woman with nails painted the color of new money waved him toward the lounge without looking up from her monitor. "Someone will be with you shortly," she said, in the voice reserved for delivery drivers and people asking for directions. Robert settled into one of the low, uncomfortable chairs, the kind designed to discourage loitering. The walls around him were a collage of marketing campaigns, bold slogans, smiling models, sleek technology. Everything gleamed with the careful polish of a company obsessed with appearing young, hungry, invincible. The irony wasn't lost on him. From his seat, Robert could hear snatches of conversation. A heated debate over social media metrics, a complaint about an outdated platform, laughter sharp as glass over some blunder made by the old guy in accounting. The words weren't meant for him, but they reached him anyway, casual and careless. He waited. An hour passed. Executives walked by without a second glance. Meetings started and ended. Coffee was poured, deadlines whispered, ambitions sharpened. Still, he waited. It wasn't the first time he had been underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last. He had long ago learned the value of being overlooked, the way invisibility allowed you to move unseen through the spaces ambition left blind. Finally, a junior associate appeared, all nerves and hurried politeness. "Sorry for the wait, Mr. Hale. We're ready to see you now." Robert rose slowly, his joints creaking in protest not from age, but from decades spent building the very foundations others now sprinted across without gratitude. He followed the young man down the hall, past glass-walled conference rooms filled with people too young to remember a world without smartphones, too eager to prove themselves in battles fought with buzzwords instead of strategy. They led him to a conference room with a long table and a dozen faces arranged around it. Half of them didn't even bother to hide their confusion as he entered. Some tried to mask it with tight smiles. Some didn't bother. The department head, a man named Carson Ward with a haircut expensive enough to finance a semester of college, cleared his throat and stood. "Mr. Hale, thank you for coming in today. We'll try to make this quick," he said, already glancing at the clock. Robert said nothing. He simply opened his briefcase, pulled out a slim folder, and placed it on the table. Inside were the documents none of them expected. Ownership transfers, acquisition terms, board restructuring notices. Carson flipped through the pages, his confident smile faltering, then collapsing entirely. Murmurs spread around the room like wildfire. Robert waited until the realization sank in fully. Waited until every smug expression cracked. Waited until the weight of the moment landed like a hammer. Then and only then he spoke, his voice low, steady, and infinitely patient. "Gentlemen," he said, sweeping the room with a glance, "I'm not here to apply for a job. He let the silence stretch, savoring the shift as the power drained from their chairs and flowed into his. I'm here because, as of this morning, I own controlling interest in Harrington Dynamics. Effective immediately. Gasps. Protests. Frantic flipping of pages. But it was too late. The old man they had looked past, the relic they had ignored, was not begging for a place at their table. He was here to build a new one. And they were about to find out exactly how much weight experience could carry. The walls of the conference room seemed to close in as the weight of the documents spread across the polished table. Conversations that once flowed easily now stumbled, words catching on dry tongues. The confidence, so carefully cultivated with tailored suits and memorized jargon, bled from the room like air from a punctured tire. Carson Ward, still clutching the folder as if it might dissolve in his hands, forced a laugh. It came out thin and strained. "Mr. Hale, surely there's been some kind of misunderstanding," he said, pitching his voice into the oily range reserved for smoothing over disasters. Robert Hale didn't smile. He didn't blink. He merely leaned back in his chair, folding his hands loosely in front of him, letting the silence sharpen the edge of the moment. "There's no misunderstanding," he said quietly. The younger executives glanced at each other, searching for someone to lead the counterattack. But the familiar playbook, the casual dismissal, the manufactured outrage, the backchannel alliances wouldn't work here. The man across the table wasn't scrambling for approval. He wasn't begging to be heard. He already owned the building they were sitting in. Owned the chairs they fidgeted in. Owned the futures they had taken for granted. A junior VP, one of the sharper knives in the drawer, tried a different angle. "With all due respect," she began, lacing the words with condescension thinly veiled as courtesy, "Harrington Dynamics is a fast-paced, highly adaptive company. We thrive on innovation, agility, youthful energy. I'm not sure your management style would align with our vision." It was a statement dressed as a question, a polite throat-slitting. Robert regarded her for a long moment, the hint of a smile ghosting across his lips, not warm but sharpened by patience honed over decades. "I built companies when fax machines were considered cutting edge," he said softly. "I adapted when the internet rewrote every rule in the playbook. I survived 4 recessions, 3 technological revolutions, and more mergers than you've had years in this industry. Agility isn't measured by how fast you can adopt a new app." He let that sink in before continuing. "It's measured by how well you survive when the ground shifts beneath you." Around the table, eyes dropped. Pens tapped nervously. One of the marketing leads, who had made a career of riding trends like waves, shifted in her seat, visibly uncomfortable. Carson tried again, desperate now. "Even so," he said, his voice tightening, "you can't expect to just waltz in here and overhaul everything. There are systems in place. Protocols." Robert leaned forward, his voice dropping an octave. "I'm not interested in waltzing, Mr. Ward. I'm interested in building something that lasts." He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out another document, a vision plan. 5 pages. Simple. Ruthless. A restructuring proposal that would eliminate redundancy, streamline operations, and focus the company not on flash-in-the-pan trends, but on sustainable innovation. It wasn't a demolition. It was a rebirth. And it would require sacrifices, starting with those who clung to titles instead of results. The executives scanned the document, their faces paling. Under the proposed plan, bloated middle management positions would be trimmed. Promotions based on tenure alone would end. Performance would reign over pedigree. Real results, not alliances, would dictate who stayed and who left. For years, Harrington Dynamics had rewarded appearances. Now it would reward substance. Carson pushed the papers away as if they might bite him. This is madness," he sputtered. Robert rose slowly, smoothing the front of his jacket with the same deliberate patience that had unnerved boardrooms long before most of these executives had finished high school. "Madness," he said, "is assuming the world will wait for you to catch up simply because you're young." He gathered his briefcase, offering a final glance around the table. "Effective immediately, department evaluations will begin. Leadership will be reassessed. Those who thrive under real scrutiny will have nothing to fear." And with that, he walked out of the conference room, leaving behind a silence so thick it buzzed. The meeting they thought they controlled had become their reckoning. And Robert Hale, the man they thought was too old to matter, had only just begun. Change didn't arrive with banners or speeches. It crept in like a rising tide, slow at first, almost imperceptible until those who had dismissed it found themselves standing on islands of irrelevance, the ground eroded from beneath their feet. Robert Hale understood this better than anyone. He didn't issue grand proclamations from a podium. He didn't gather the entire company for town halls filled with buzzwords and empty promises. He simply began. The first signs were small but unmistakable. The bloated, multi-step approval processes that had once choked innovation were dismantled overnight. Teams that had spent weeks battling through bureaucratic sludge suddenly found themselves trusted to act, to create, to deliver. Middle managers who had built entire careers atop empire building and blame-shifting discovered, to their horror, that their endless chains of meetings had been replaced by metrics, clear, brutal, and indifferent to office politics. Results were measured. Efficiency was rewarded. Excuses were not. In the marketing department, where campaigns were once approved based on who lunching with which VP, projects now lived and died by data, creativity, and real-world impact. In operations, processes that had stagnated under layers of tradition were torn down and rebuilt by people who had been ignored for years, people who actually understood the work because they did it every day. And throughout it all, Robert moved through the building like a quiet storm. He made no announcements of his visits. He sat at the edges of meetings, listening without interrupting. He walked the factory floors, the server rooms, the design labs, asking questions that pierced through rehearsed answers like knives. At first, employees were nervous. Skeptical. They had been conditioned to believe that leadership was distant, unreachable, a force that appeared only to punish or extract. But Robert's approach was different. He asked the night shift workers what tools would make their jobs easier. He sat with junior engineers and asked them what roadblocks they faced and then actually removed them. He listened longer than he spoke. And slowly, the building began to breathe again. Not everyone adapted. Some clung to the old ways with white-knuckle desperation. They whispered in back corridors, plotting comebacks, betting on Robert's inevitable failure. They didn't understand that they were already relics of a past that wasn't coming back. When the first wave of resignations came, Robert accepted them without fanfare. He didn't chase after the departing managers or beg for loyalty that had never been genuine. He let them leave, their absence clearing space for new voices, new blood, new ideas. He promoted not based on tenure but on vision. And in turn, with a sharp mind and a sharper sense of strategy, found herself leading a major project within months. A maintenance worker who had spotted inefficiencies in warehouse layouts was invited into operational meetings usually reserved for executives. Talent was elevated. Entitlement was discarded. And the numbers began to tell the story even before the press did. Quarterly reports showed a company leaner, faster, and more profitable. Clients noticed the difference, too, not just in products, but in responsiveness, creativity, authenticity. The board, initially wary of Robert's quiet revolution, saw the results and began to shift their tune. Stock prices stabilized, then climbed. Partners who had once kept Harrington Dynamics at arm's length now sought collaborations. The company wasn't just surviving. It was thriving. Late one evening, Robert stood at the top of the building looking out over the city lights. He could still remember how they had looked past him on that first day, how their eyes had slid away, uninterested, certain he was another relic wandering toward irrelevance. He could have lashed out. He could have demanded respect. He could have made them kneel. Instead, he had rebuilt the very foundation beneath their feet so thoroughly that by the time they noticed the ground shifting, they had already lost their footing. Change wasn't about noise. It was about patience. It was about endurance. And it was about knowing that sometimes the quietest revolutions leave the deepest marks. Robert Hale turned from the window, the city sprawling endlessly beyond, and smiled. The quiet storm had only just begun. Not everyone surrendered quietly. In the hidden corners of Harrington Dynamics, resentment festered like mold beneath polished surfaces. It was whispered in darkened conference rooms after hours. It was scribbled in hastily encrypted messages between executives who believed they were too valuable to be challenged, too ingrained to be uprooted. They called it the old man's crusade, mocking Robert Hale's reforms, spinning them as outdated idealism, as naivete wrapped in experience. They convinced themselves that soon enough the board would see reason, that profits would stumble, that the shareholders would grow restless for flashier leadership. They forgot the most crucial rule of survival. Never underestimate a man who has already outlived 100 storms before you even learned how to spell your own name. The first signs of active resistance were clumsy. A lost report here. A crucial email that accidentally never got sent. Deliberate delays, dragged feet, passive sabotage dressed in bureaucratic language. Robert noticed. He didn't react immediately. He didn't storm into meetings or slam fists onto tables. He let them weave their net around themselves, thread by thread, each act of petty sabotage noted, catalogued, measured. He understood patience better than anyone. And he understood the value of timing. When the quarterly review approached, the saboteurs smirked behind closed doors. Numbers had been skewed. Targets missed. Performance graphs dipped just enough to sow doubt. It was their chance to strike. At the review meeting, they sharpened their blades in words dressed as concern. Talk of strategic misalignment. Suggestions for a return to traditional leadership models. Thinly veiled calls for Robert's early retirement couched in the language of corporate diplomacy. Robert listened to every word without interruption, his face a study in calm. He let them finish their performance, let the whispers swell into momentum they thought unstoppable. Then he opened the second set of documents he had prepared. Performance audits. Internal communications flagged by IT. Financial reports cross-checked by third-party auditors. Evidence of deliberate negligence, willful obstruction, and worst of all in the eyes of shareholders, costs inflicted not by strategy but by ego. One by one, he read the findings aloud, his voice steady, implacable. Faces paled. Smirks faded into grim lines. One by one, those who had plotted his downfall realized that the floor beneath them was giving way. The board members, silent until now, shifted their attention. Not to Robert, but away from those who had embarrassed them. In the aftermath, terminations followed swiftly. Not vindicatively. Professionally. The way a surgeon cuts out dead tissue to save the patient. Robert accepted each resignation letter without ceremony, offering the same polite nod to those departing as he had offered on his first day when they thought he was nobody. In the vacuum left behind, new leaders rose. Not polished networkers. Not the loudest voices in the room. But the ones who had done the work quietly, diligently, waiting for a world that finally recognized substance over show. The culture shifted with a momentum that could no longer be stopped. Where once meetings had been battlefields for vanity, now they buzzed with genuine ideas. Where once decisions were made to protect fiefdoms, now they were made to serve vision. Robert watched it happen, not with gloating, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had seen the same cycle repeat across decades, across industries, across lifetimes. Resistance, he knew, wasn't a sign of failure. It was the final howl of those who mistook comfort for invincibility. Late one evening, after the building emptied out and the city lights blinked in the fog, Robert walked through the empty halls. The floors gleamed, the air hummed with possibility. He paused outside the main conference room, the same room where they had once looked through him, past him, around him. He opened the door and stepped inside. There was no one left to tell him he didn't belong. No one left to challenge his right to lead. Only the future, stretching ahead, waiting for him to shape it. Experience hadn't made him slower. It had made him inevitable. In the months that followed the purge, Harrington dynamics began to change in ways even its oldest critics couldn't ignore. It didn't happen with grand ceremonies or corporate rebranding campaigns. No expensive logos. No soulless slogans. The change was organic, growing quietly at first, like green shoots breaking through old concrete. And once it began, nothing could stop it. The first sign was the energy in the halls. Where once conversations were whispered behind closed doors, now teams huddled in open spaces, tossing ideas back and forth with the kind of excited urgency that had been missing for years. Collaboration replaced competition. Curiosity replaced cynicism. Employees who had once kept their heads down out of fear now spoke up, proposed solutions, took risks. The company's physical spaces changed too. Robert ordered the old executive offices dismantled, those grand corner spaces with their private bathrooms and isolationist glass walls. In their place rose open workspaces, bright with natural light, where leadership sat shoulder to shoulder with their teams. No one was too important to be accessible now. It wasn't about optics. It was about rebuilding trust. It was about reminding every person in the company that they were part of something bigger than status, bigger than profit margins. The effects rippled outward. Clients who had grown cold began to return. Vendors who once padded invoices with late fees found themselves renegotiating contracts with partners who now held firm and fair lines. New projects launched with agility once thought impossible, not because Robert demanded miracles, but because he trusted the right people and removed the wrong ones. Revenue rose not in sudden, volatile spikes, but in steady, climbing lines, the kind that spoke of something sustainable rather than desperate. And with each success, Robert pushed further. He implemented mentorship programs pairing seasoned veterans with younger talent, not to reinforce hierarchies, but to create symbiosis, mutual respect across generations. He scrapped the antiquated performance review system in favor of real-time feedback loops. Promotions no longer depended on who you played golf with but on what you created, improved, built. He initiated open-door months where any employee, from entry-level intern to mid-tier technician, could book 15 minutes to present an idea directly to senior leadership, including Robert himself. And he showed up. Every time. Word spread outside the company too. Articles in business magazines shifted in tone from skeptical to curious to admiring. Phrases like quiet turnaround and the Hale method began appearing alongside metrics showing growth the market couldn't ignore. Investors who had once muttered about fresh blood now praised his vision. Competitors scrambled to copy changes they didn't fully understand. Robert watched it all unfold with the steady calm of a man who had never sought applause, only impact. He knew better than anyone that real success was not measured in headlines. It was measured in the moments when people realized they were building something worth staying for, worth fighting for, worth believing in. One evening, long after most had gone home, Robert stood on the building's rooftop, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. The city stretched out below him in a scatter of lights and distant sounds. It struck him then. The company he had inherited was not the same creature they had once tried to bar him from. It wasn't just surviving now. It was alive. Not because he had dragged it forward by force, but because he had shown it how to find its own footing again. How to value wisdom and curiosity over ego and appearances. How to move not faster, but smarter. Below, a few office lights still burned. A team staying late to finish a pitch they believed in. A group of engineers sketching prototypes on a whiteboard. Laughter spilling into the hallway. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was real. And it was just the beginning. Robert turned from the city, the night air crisp against his face, and smiled. Not a triumphant grin, but the quiet, knowing smile of a builder watching his foundation hold strong against the winds. The man they said was too old to matter had built a future younger than any of them could dream. And tomorrow he would build more. Legacy was a word Robert Hale had learned to distrust. He had seen too many men chase it like a prize, carving their names into buildings, commissioning portraits to hang in boardrooms where no one ever looked at them. He had watched them crumble when the world moved on without asking permission, leaving behind only plaques gathering dust and titles stripped of meaning. He knew better. Real legacy wasn't what you left behind. It was what you built into others so deeply they didn't even realize they carried it. And now, as he walked the halls of Harrington Dynamics, he could feel it. Alive not in marble, but in movement. In voices rising without fear. In ideas no longer trapped under layers of cautious approval. He didn't need a wing named after him. He didn't need a commemorative ceremony. He needed only to know that the place he rebuilt would stand long after he was no longer there to hold it. Change had settled deep into the company's bones. New leaders had emerged, not the loudest, not the flashiest, but the ones who had proven themselves through work that mattered. Managers who knew how to listen. Teams that thrived on collaboration, not competition. Innovations that came not from panic, but from passion. And somewhere along the way, something even more remarkable happened. The culture Robert had seeded began to outgrow him. Departments initiated their own reforms, streamlining systems further than he had imagined. Employees started mentorship programs without waiting for executive approval. Communities blossomed within the company, focused on learning, growth, and inclusivity. The DNA had changed. Permanently. One afternoon, at a quarterly review meeting, a junior analyst, someone Robert had never formally met, stood up at the end of a presentation and said, without irony, without rehearsal, "Here, we don't care how old you are. We care how much you're willing to build." The room nodded, casual, unthinking, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Robert leaned back in his chair, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. They didn't even realize they were quoting him. Not his words, but his spirit. And that was exactly how it should be. Time moved differently now. The once frantic churn of meaningless urgency had settled into a steady rhythm of progress. Not without challenges, not without setbacks, but always forward. And Robert, too, knew it was time. Not to quit, not to fade away, but to step aside with intention before the world needed to ask. He spent months preparing his transition, grooming a leadership team that understood the deeper currents beneath quarterly earnings and shareholder meetings. He left behind not just structures, but principles embedded into policies, traditions, rituals of collaboration that no single successor could erase. And on his final official day as CEO, there were no grand speeches. He gathered the company in the open-air atrium he had built in the heart of the campus, a space where anyone, from janitor to vice president, could sit under the same open sky. He spoke simply. About resilience. About patience. About never confusing noise for wisdom. About building things that last longer than pride. When he finished, the crowd rose, not with forced applause, but with something real, a gratitude woven into every hand clap, every tear caught hurriedly behind glasses. And then, without waiting for fanfare, Robert Hale picked up his worn leather briefcase, adjusted his coat, and walked out into the afternoon sun. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Because behind him stretched a living legacy, not carved into stone, but stitched into the spirit of a company that had once looked at him and seen only age. Now they carried forward the truth they had been too blind to see before. Experience is not a burden. It is the foundation from which all greatness rises. Robert Hale disappeared into the city crowds, an old man to those who didn't know better. But to those who did, he was the architect of a future that would outlive them all.